amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
The Meno is Plato's shortest dialogue, and it's concerned with lots of various philosophical issues, including moral issues. The dialogue opens with a discussion about the moral issue of whether virtue is teachable or not. This discussion about virtue between Meno, the titular character of the dialogue, and Socrates leads to an epistemological issue, the Paradox of Enquiry. The Paradox of Enquiry, as proposed by Meno, argues that inquiry into something we have no knowledge of is impossible, as if we have no knowledge of something, we cannot know where to begin, and even if we do find information, we have no way of knowing that we have found it. Socrates then proposes a theory of recollection as a means of rejecting the argument. Is the theory of recollection the best way for Socrates to reject the paradox, though? Well, taken at its face value, this question may seem like a simple one, but I'll discuss that here and we'll see why there may be more to it than it first seems. In order to understand why this is, it's important to understand what leads Meno to propose the paradox to begin with. Plato's dialogue opens with Meno asking Socrates whether virtue is something that can be taught. Socrates' response to this is that he does not know, as he does not know what virtue is and has never met anyone else who knows what virtue is either. This then leads to a bit of an exchange between Meno and Socrates regarding exactly what virtue is. During this exchange, Meno provides two definitions of virtue, both of which are rejected by Socrates as they are examples of virtue, and what Socrates is searching for is a definition that captures the essence of what virtue is. After both of Meno's definitions are rejected by Socrates, the exchange becomes slightly more heated. Meno accuses Socrates of reminding him of a torpedo fish, a fish known to sting prey and leave the prey feeling numb. Meno then proposes the Paradox of Enquiry. While what follows focuses mainly on the Paradox of Enquiry and what led to its proposal may seem irrelevant to that, hopefully it'll become clear later why the build-up to Meno putting it forward is important. So, what's the Paradox of Enquiry? The Paradox of Enquiry proposed by Meno argues that it is useless to inquire into something that we have no knowledge of, for reasons stated previously. The paradox is rephrased slightly by Socrates, with Socrates' rewording of the paradox expanding it to include all forms of inquiry and missing out a part of Meno's own wording of the paradox. Socrates' version includes the idea that it is pointless for someone with knowledge of something to inquire into it as they already have the knowledge, and it's impossible to inquire into something we have no knowledge of, for we do not know where to begin. Well, both of these phrasings are slightly different. Meno accepts Socrates' rewording, and the dialogue continues with Socrates proposing his theory of recollection in order to reject the paradox. Though the idea that Socrates uses it to reject the paradox is questioned by Scott in his 2006 work, Plato's Meno. In the dialogue, Socrates uses a slave boy to prove to Meno that knowledge is simply recollection. During the interaction, Socrates first shows Meno that the slave boy has no instruction in mathematics, and then proceeds to have the slave boy calculate the area of a square, which, after a couple of failed attempts, the slave boy manages to do. Socrates then puts forward the conclusion that knowledge is something that is innate. We are simply recollecting what we already know but have forgotten, rather than learning something new. Socrates uses an argument that souls are eternal and retain all the things that they have learned in order to justify his reasoning. Though Russell and Weiss gives us good reason to argue that Socrates did not actually believe this himself. However, what is important is whether or not this is the best answer Socrates could have given to reject the paradox proposed by Meno. So, is this the best answer that Socrates could have given to reject the paradox of inquiry? One of the problems with the paradox, in both the forms presented by Socrates and by Meno, is that it presents knowledge as an all-or-nothing situation. The paradox infers that we either have complete knowledge of something, or we have no knowledge of something. However, this is not always or necessarily the case. We may have partial information about something, and that partial information can lead us to further inquiry, and further discoveries about whether it is under investigation. For example, we can know of the existence of the Meno, but know nothing else beyond the title, and that it is written by Plato. This would allow us to enter a library or a bookshop and purchase or borrow a copy. We can then read the Meno and learn more about the dialogue itself. After reading the Meno, we can then turn to further reading material that explores the dialogue even further, such material as by Barbara Fine, Weiss, or Scott. We could then go from having no knowledge about the Meno to having knowledge about various aspects of the Meno, showing that the paradox does not hold up to further scrutiny, as knowledge is not an all-or-nothing state. Showing the false dichotomy of the all-or-nothing view of knowledge that the paradox presents is certainly a much better way of rejecting that paradox. This means that there is a better answer than the one that Socrates gives to Meno in the dialogue. However, is this the best answer that Socrates could have given in the dialogue itself? Well, that's a different matter and would really depend on the perception of best that we use concerning the dialogue. Are we speaking of the best way to reject the paradox altogether, or are we speaking of the best way that Socrates could have rejected it in the dialogue? Well, you might think that this is something of an irrelevant distinction. It'll become clear why this is important. Something that should be remembered about Plato is that he was a very deliberate writer. He chose his arguments and his words very carefully. This can be seen in any works that attempt to give a fuller exposition on his dialogue, such as the works by Fine, Scott, and Weiss that are cited here. Plato also wrote differently to most other philosophers, choosing to write dialogues or long monologues rather than treatises and essays, even choosing between dialogue and monologue in a purposeful way. Plato's dialogues take on an almost play-like structure, minus the stage directions, of course. This means that any of Plato's dialogues should be approached with care and thoughtfulness. A surface reading of any of Plato's dialogues will enable the reader to learn various philosophical arguments and problems, of course. However, Plato not only wanted us to learn various philosophical arguments and philosophical problems from his works, he also wanted us to learn how to do philosophy from reading his works. In order to understand this fully, it's necessary to delve into the Meno at a slightly deeper level, beginning with the introduction. The introduction sees the dialogue open with Meno asking Socrates about virtue and whether it can be taught or not. However, there is more to it than that. If one pays attention to the dialogue itself, they can see an attempt from Plato to introduce the kind of people that Socrates and Meno are, and to introduce a dramatic tension to the dialogue. The dialogue is more than simply an exchange of philosophical ideas promoted through the medium of conversation. It is an attempt to entertain the reader and draw them towards philosophy, while at the same time teaching them philosophy and how to do philosophy. After setting the scene, Plato then moves on to the first philosophical discussion and philosophical problem, the defining of virtue. In the next section, Socrates requests Meno to define virtue for him, and Meno duly complies with that request. Meno provides Socrates with what Socrates calls a swarm of virtues, as Meno defines what a man's virtue is and what a woman's virtue is. Socrates then rejects Meno's definition because what he's looking for are not examples of virtue in action, but a definition that kind of captures the essence of virtue. What Socrates is looking for is a common definition that covers all examples of virtue, be it a man, a woman, a child, an old man, a slave, and etc., etc. Here, Plato is showing us, through Socrates, the importance of understanding the essence or oneness of whatever is under investigation. For while examples of what is under investigation can help us to discover the essence, discovering the essence is what leads us to knowledge about what is under investigation. Socrates then asks Meno to reformulate his definition in order that they may get at the essence of what virtue is, using the idea that while there are many types of bees, each type having differences from the other types, there are certain defining factors that make all of them bees. After further prompting, Meno then produces another definition of virtue, this time defining it as the desire for good things and the ability to acquire them. Socrates again rejects this definition as it does not fit the oneness criterion, and it is here that the dialogue takes a different turn, and we see Meno's attitude change. Here, Meno goes on the attack, his pride injured after his inability to define virtue is exposed by Socrates. The dialogue continues, with Meno eventually accusing Socrates of being a torpedo fish, stating that Socrates has left Meno numb and in a confused state. For where Meno believed he understood what virtue is and thought defining virtue was simple, instead he has been left unable to define virtue. And then it is here that Socrates proposes the theory of recollection. Scott, 2006, argues that the theory of recollection may not have been proposed simply to solve the dilemma put forward by Meno, though, for various reasons. One reason is that to solve the dilemma, one only needs to reject the all-or-nothing view of knowledge, as proposed earlier. As Scott says, one only needs to appeal to the Meno's own distinction between knowledge and true belief. Scott also argues that recollection is neither necessary nor sufficient to solve the dilemma, as recollection is an account of where our knowledge comes from, and therefore is not a solution to the paradox. However, Socrates may not have put forward the theory of recollection as an attempt to reject the paradox, but instead as an attempt to disarm Meno. Previously, Socrates gave Meno definitions of shape and color, and Meno chooses the definition that is less simple and has a more theatrical feel to it. So what Plato may be doing here is attempting to show us how to get a conversation back on track after the interlocutor has suffered from aporia, by choosing to use terms and styles of definitions that will please the interlocutor and draw them back into the discussion. So the answer to the question of the best way for Socrates to reject the paradox of enquiry is to argue that knowledge is not an all-or-nothing state. We can indeed hold partial information about the object of our inquiry, and this partial information can guide us towards knowledge through dialectical inquiry such as the Socratic method. However, the best way for Socrates to reject the paradox of enquiry in the Meno itself may have been the theory of recollection, for there is more to Plato's dialogue than simply giving us the best answer to the paradox. As stated, there is always more than meets the eye when it comes to Plato's work.